high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where we toil in the vineyard of historical perspective so that you can drink the sweet, sweet nectar of erudition. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America, and all ships at sea. Welcome to the Blast Radius. So glad you could join us this evening. And yes, you do get intellectual bonus points for watching us instead of some silly sports ball game. Immigration is one of those issues where the public memory seems to reset roughly once every election cycle, as though the United States simply burst into existence in its current demographic configuration sometime during the Carter administration, and any proposed deviation from the present arrangement must therefore be rooted in either malice or ignorance. That assumption is false. America has always had immigration, but America has never had this immigration, not in scale, not in permanence, not in structure, and not in the accompanying insistence that asking questions about it is, in and of itself, an indictment of the questioner's moral character. So tonight, in the enduring interest of the public mental hygiene, we will do what we always endeavor to do on this program: slow down the tape, widen the aperture, and take a look at how immigration has actually worked for most of American history, not as a moral parable, not as an aspirational exercise based on feelings and emotion, but as a guided set of principles, traditionally at least, with limits, pauses, expectations, and consequences. There will be no demonization here, even when it might be warranted. There will be no sanctification here, even when it gives us warm, fuzzy feelings in our tum-tum. What there will be are numbers, norms, verifiable facts about the historical record, and even the occasional uncomfortable comparison that some bleating buffoons who prefer that we never think deeply about matters of great nuance and complexity would prefer that we don't make. So please securely fasten your safety harnesses and keep any dangling appendages inside the vehicle at all times. There are no helicopters and Humvees this week, but there are steamships, quotas, exclusion acts, and at least one moment where nostalgia proves less stupid than modern certainty. Episode 1, 1607 to 1776. Settlement is not immigration. Before we can talk about immigration, we must first dispose of a category error that poisons nearly every modern discussion of this subject. And the error is this: early America was not built by immigrants in the modern sense. It was built by settlers. That distinction is one that matters, and it matters a very great deal. The people who arrived at Jamestown and Plymouth and the other early 17th century colonies were not entering a stable, sovereign nation state with a labor market and a welfare apparatus and a legal identity already in place. They were founding societies from scratch, often badly, sometimes fatally. Your host's own paternal ancestors arrived with the third supply to Jamestown in 1609, a voyage so catastrophic that history remembers the following winter as the starving time. And that starvation was your reward for being lucky enough to be on one of the 7 vessels that actually arrived at the destination, and not the one that got shipwrecked in Bermuda or the one that was lost at sea without a trace. Which is to say, this was not an Ellis Island welcome center. This was try not to die of malnourishment or dysentery while attempting to invent a country. Settlement required total assimilation because there was nothing to be multicultural with. There was one language, one legal system, one political culture, and survival depended on adopting all of it immediately. No one arrived demanding accommodation, no one arrived expecting support, and no one arrived with the option of remaining culturally separate for generations on end. The early colonies were harsh, exclusionary, and unapologetically selective, not out of cruelty, but of necessity. A weak society cannot absorb unlimited difference. If it tries, it collapses. That principle does not vanish with time. It merely becomes unfashionable to mention it. Episode 2, 1776 to 1840. A republic opens the door carefully. After independence, the United States did become a nation capable of receiving immigrants, but it did so cautiously, with an eye toward cohesion rather than sentiment. Early immigration policy was almost aggressively boring. There were no mass intakes, there was no permanent entitlement to entry, and crucially, there was no blanket assumption that everyone who arrived would be allowed to stay, and no one suggested that there ought to be. Naturalization took time, political rights took longer, and the expectation was clear. Newcomers would adopt the language, laws, and civic habits of the Republic, not negotiate with them, not express hostility and contempt toward them, and not sneeringly dismiss them as being inferior to what existed in the place they voluntarily emigrated from to begin with. It's the most basic, most elemental part of the immigration compact, but today, it's been almost completely discarded. When you go to a new country, the onus is on you to fit in with the way they do things. To put it in the simplest of metaphorical terms, when you are a guest in someone else's home, you don't get to complain about the interior decor. Immigration levels rose and fell organically over the years, commensurate with the demands of the labor market and the exigencies of economic expansion. When the country needed people, it welcomed them. When it didn't, immigration slowed, sometimes dramatically, sometimes completely. And no one of any political stripe considered this in any way controversial. The idea that a nation might pause immigration to consolidate its population, stabilize wages, or absorb previous arrivals was considered common sense. Not cruelty, not xenophobia, not a moral emergency. Immigration was understood as a privilege extended by a sovereign people, not a human right enforceable against them. This understanding will persist, remarkably intact, for well over a century. Episode 3, 1840 to 1914, Ellis Island and the Myth of the Open Door. This is the period that is most often invoked and most often wildly misunderstood. Yes, immigration numbers were high. Yes, millions arrived. And yes, America absorbed them because it filtered them. Ellis Island was not a welcome mat, it was a sieve. Between 20% and in some years as many as 50% of arriving passengers were rejected and sent back, often at the steamship company's expense. Why? Because the rules were blunt and they were unapologetic. If you were sick, you didn't get in. If you were disabled, you didn't get in. If you could not plausibly support yourself through labor, you didn't get in. If you became a public charge, you could, and most likely would, be deported. There was no social safety net. There were no entitlement programs. There certainly was no concept of importing entire extended families with the expectation of permanent public support. Immigration was tolerated, even encouraged, precisely because it was conditional. And most crucially of all, assimilation was non-negotiable. Your great-great-grandparents arriving from Norway in the 1880s, as this reporter's maternal great-great-grandparents did not arrive as something called Norwegian Americans. They arrived as Norwegians who were expected immediately to engage themselves in the work of becoming Americans. They understood the expectation, and they abided by it without resentment or complaint. They learned to like the things the Americans liked. Why? Well, do you remember the old saying, when in Rome, do as the Romans do? There is a reason that axiom has existed for 2.5 millennia, because it's a wise and useful bit of advice. They learned English. They adopted American civic norms. They participated in American institutions. They retained their cultural memory, culinary preferences, old world folk tales, religious predilections, and what have you, but they did so privately, not as a rival identity. That is what the melting pot looks like. We call it the melting pot precisely because it melts. Episode 4, 1882 to 1924, limits, exclusions, and a nation says, that's enough for now. As industrialization accelerated, immigration surged, and with it came social strain, wage pressure, and political backlash. The response was not hysteria, it was legislation. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was ugly, discriminatory, and morally compromised, and it also reflected a broad consensus that immigration policy existed to protect social cohesion and labor stability, not anyone's abstract ideals or emotional peccadillos. The same logic produced literacy tests, health requirements, and eventually national origin quotas, the sort of things over which we've been conditioned to gasp and clutch our pearls in the present day, but which, again, were not remotely controversial in a country where there was common, nearly universal assent to the notion that immigration exists primarily for the benefit of the nation, and whatever benefits redound to individual immigrants and their descendants are a function of them living up to their end of the bargain by being productive, engaged, well-behaving members of the society they have been allowed to join. And here is the key point that the modern discourse often refuses to acknowledge. These policies were bipartisan, they were popular, and they worked. From 1924 onward, immigration dropped sharply, wages rose, assimilation accelerated, ethnic enclaves thinned out, and the country digested what it had already taken in. This was not seen as a betrayal of American values, it was seen correctly as responsible stewardship. No serious person believed immigration should be infinite. No serious person believed assimilation was optional. And no serious person believed demographic transformation was a cost-free proposition. That consensus will hold largely unquestioned until the late 20th century. Episode 5, 1965 to 1985, the quiet revolution nobody voted for. And here is where everything changes, and drastically does it change, practically overnight. The 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act is often falsely portrayed as a moral correction to earlier acts of alleged discrimination. What it actually did was far more consequential and far less openly debated. It abolished national origin quotas. It introduced family reunification as the primary driver of immigration, and perhaps most pertinently of all, it quietly decoupled immigration levels from labor demand, assimilation capacity, and any semblance of historical precedent. At the time, its proponents, and make no mistake, this is what we would call in our current day parlance a broad bipartisan coalition, assured the public that overall immigration levels would not increase by any significant degree. Needless to say, they were wrong. Spectacularly wrong, in fact. Or alternatively, they were all a bunch of damned liars. What followed was the invention of a brand new societal norm that was never put to voters at the ballot box. Permanent, high-volume, seven-figure immigration every single year, indefinitely. No pauses, no digestion periods, no meaningful assimilation enforcement, and eventually no expectation that newcomers would adopt the dominant culture at all. This was not in any respect the historical American model. It was another thing entirely. It was a top-down social engineering experiment, conducted without public consent and justified retroactively by brute force moral intimidation and public shaming of anyone who was unwise enough to start asking questions about its wisdom and its utility. And once set in motion, it proved very difficult to stop. Episode 6, Melting Pot versus Multiculturalism, two very different animals. At this point, it becomes necessary to address the distinction that modern discourse does everything in its power to blur beyond recognition. The melting pot and multiculturalism are not synonyms. They are not even adjacent concepts. They are, as a practical matter, opposing social theories. The melting pot is premised on convergence. It assumes a dominant civic culture into which newcomers are expected to integrate, not to erase their past, not to abandon private traditions, not to forfeit cultural memory, but to adopt a shared public identity, because a coherent and cohesive society, in order to be that, demands that they must. Multiculturalism rejects this premise entirely, and proudly does it do so. It says, move to a new country and make no personal concessions whatever. Do not learn the language, do not adopt the norms, do not subordinate your prior identity to the civic culture that you have joined. Instead, import the old country wholesale and expect, even demand, that the host society adapt to you. If and when it declines to do so, start shrieking about racism and xenophobia. The result is not diversity, it is fragmentation. A melting pot produces a coherent culture with internal variation. Multiculturalism produces parallel societies that increasingly view one another with suspicion, resentment, or outright hostility. And here is the crucial historical point. America was not built as a multicultural society. It was built as a pluralistic one, which is a different thing altogether. Pluralism assumes and expects and welcomes and encourages disagreement within a commonly shared framework. Multiculturalism dismantles the framework itself, then pours gasoline on its remains, and then lights them on fire. No nation survives that indefinitely. In fact, if you're looking for the quickest route to societal atomization and the doomed spiral toward failed nationhood that invariably accompanies it, you don't need to ask your GPS for directions. Just jump on the multiculturalism highway, and you'll be there before you know it. Episode 7, Chain Migration, the Welfare State, and Perverse Incentives. Now we arrive at a problem our predecessors did not face, because they were serious people and they were wise enough not to create it in the first place. Historically, immigration functioned in a world without a modern welfare state. If you couldn't work, you didn't eat. If you couldn't support yourself, you didn't stay. And nothing about that was xenophobic or immoral or remotely objectionable to any sane person with an IQ above room temperature. The idea that nations should import millions of people with no future potential to be anything but public charges just out of some misguided desire to be benevolent and multicultural is not just inadvisable, it's not just stupid, it is stark raving madness. It's the kind of stark raving madness that turns high-functioning societies into failed states. In fact, there's no other possible end result when you start going down that road. The math simply doesn't math, and the numbers do not care about your feelings. If you import hundreds of thousands, even millions, of unproductive, unskilled, non-able-bodied persons year after year after year, your society will fail. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. You might be able to delay it somewhat by reducing your native-born population to a condition of ever-increasing penury and destitution, but you cannot permanently forestall a thing that is, by its very nature, unavoidable. The ship is going to hit the iceberg, and it is going to sink. And all the fancy people with all the fancy qualifications and all the fancy degrees will look at each other quizzically and exclaim, "How did this happen?" When immigration was tied to the capacity for self-sufficiency, as it was throughout 80% of American history, it imposed a natural selection pressure that favored the industrious, the adaptable, and the motivated. In other words, precisely the kinds of people that a growing nation wants. Chain migration fundamentally alters that equation, and not in a good way. When immigration policy prioritizes extended family reunification over skills, over labor demand, and over assimilation potential, and combines that with a vast and far too generous social safety net, it severs the connection between immigration and contribution. You are no longer selecting for builders, you are selecting for dependents. This is not a moral judgment about individuals, rather, it is a structural critique of incentives. No system can long endure when it rewards arrival more than integration, presence more than participation, and grievance more than gratitude. The idea that a nation might import millions of people indefinitely, including the elderly, the infirm, and the unskilled, and support them permanently at public expense, would have struck every prior generation of Americans as complete and utter madness, because that's what it is. Episode 8, Where America Fell Short and Ought to Own It. None of this is meant to suggest that America has always succeeded in living up to her own stated ideals where immigration is concerned. In point of fact, she most assuredly has not. Her failures, when they have occurred, have been manifold and decidedly inglorious. Chinese railroad workers did much of the work in building the backbone of the continent and were then excluded from the full participation which some of them had rightly earned. Braceros labored in American fields for decades and were sent home without the opportunities for permanence that some of them most certainly deserved. And most shamefully of all, European Jews, attempting to flee pogroms and persecution in the years preceding and immediately after the outbreak of the Second World War, were turned away with only a precious few high-profile exceptions, and many of them, far too many in fact, were thus consigned to deaths that were so horrifying as to strain the imagination of any human being with a functioning conscience. These were moral failures, to be sure. They deserve to be acknowledged. They deserve never to be downplayed or forgotten. But here is the sleight of hand in which modern pro-mass migration rhetoric attempts to engage. It treats historical injustice as a blank check for permanent policy irrationality. Acknowledging past wrongs does not require us to invent new ones. Rectifying injustice does not oblige us to abandon sovereignty. And compassion is not the same thing as willful institutional self-harm. A nation can be humane and selective at the same time. America once was that type of nation. There is no good reason why it cannot be again. Episode 9, Demographics Without Conspiracy. The elephant in the room, quietly noticed. Now we approach the part of the conversation that makes people very, very nervous indeed. So, while we will proceed with care, we will also call things what they are. Across the United States, the Anglosphere, Europe, and much of the developed world, the same pattern has emerged since the beginning of this century. Native birth rates fall below replacement level. The institution of marriage is devalued and falls into decline. Family formation collapses. Home ownership becomes unattainable for young adults. And mass immigration, accordingly, becomes the sole mechanism of population growth. Whether this outcome is intentional, accidental, or emergent is beside the point. Because irrespective of the cause, the result is the same. It's a result that is not conducive to a flourishing society. It creates a reality that nobody in their right mind should regard as being a good thing. Large-scale demographic replacement does not require a sinister cabal of evil men hatching dastardly schemes in smoke-filled rooms. It requires only incentives, in this case, perverse incentives. And incentives, especially perverse ones, have predictable consequences. To note this reality is not to ascribe motive, nor is it to live in the realm of the tinfoil hat-wearing conspiracy theorist. It is merely to observe and acknowledge that a well-documented reality exists. And well-documented realities, rhetorically inconvenient though they may be to certain people who seek to advance certain agendas, do not care about how virtuous anybody feels while ignoring them. Episode 10, What Immigration is For and Who Decides. This brings us to the central question that often lurks, often implied but rarely spoken out loud beneath every argument about immigration. Whom is this for? Is immigration policy meant to benefit migrants themselves? Is it meant to help the balance sheets of big corporations? Is it meant to confer a permanent electoral advantage upon a certain political party? Is it meant to advance a certain set of abstract global ideals? Or is it meant to benefit the nation as a whole, socially, economically, and culturally? It goes without saying that in the present day, in light of the body of evidence we have before us, the latter answer seems vanishingly unlikely to be the correct one. But for the vast majority of American history, it was the correct answer, and it was an answer that was as obvious as it was uncontroversial. Sure, there were always arguments about how many people we should let in, where they should come from, when to have a moratorium, how long it should be, but there was broad agreement across party lines that the primary beneficiaries of immigration policy are supposed to be the people who already live and work in this country. A sovereign people decide who may join them, on what terms, in what numbers, and to what end. They do not do so out of hatred or intolerance, but stewardship, not out of fear, but responsibility. A nation that loses the ability to say enough is not compassionate, it is incoherent and unserious. Epilogue, Immigration and the Obligation to Inherit. America is indeed a nation of immigrants, but more precisely, it is a nation of successfully assimilated immigrants. That success was not accidental. It was structured, it was expected, and it was enforced socially, culturally, and legally. The tragedy of the present moment is not that people want to come here. This has always been true. The tragedy is that we have forgotten what coming here is supposed to mean. A nation is not a hotel. Citizenship is not a subscription service, and identity is not infinitely divisible without consequence. If America is to endure not merely as an economic zone, but as a people and as a nation, it must recover the courage to say what every functional society has always known. Immigration is not an entitlement. It is not a human right. It is a privilege. The price of the privilege is productivity, assimilation, and good conduct. And sovereignty is non-negotiable. And if that makes some people uncomfortable, well, good. It should make them uncomfortable. Far too many people have spent far too many years living with their heads in the clouds, imagining that residency in the United States is some sort of party favor that we can pass out to anybody in the world who happens to want it. But it is not, and we cannot. So that discomfort, hopefully, is a much needed and long overdue first indication that historical memory and pragmatic rationale are perhaps at last, reasserting themselves. And as we close out this field guide, we would do well to ponder the following questions. What kind of a place do we want to be? Do we want to be a place that's worth living in, or a place where everybody gets to live? We cannot be both. We have to pick one or the other. Do we care about the inheritance that, for some of us, has been passed down by 14 generations of our forebears? Since Jamestown and Plymouth and Popham and Salem and elsewhere, do we want our own descendants 14 generations hence, in the year 2450 or thereabouts, to have access to that same inheritance? Or are we comfortable sacrificing it on the altar of some naive vision of a borderless globalist utopia that is never going to exist? And most importantly, do we have the right to make that choice at all? Is it our place to break the chain of inheritance that connects our ancestors 420 years ago and our future progeny 420 years from now? And if we choose not to break the chain, What should that inheritance look like? Should it look like a coherent, cohesive nation state that cares about its own historic values and traditions and institutions and expects, unashamedly, without apology or equivocation, that new arrivals should do the same? Or should it just look like a flag and a few scraps of old parchment that we don't pay that much attention to anymore because it's passé and unfashionable? And as those questions hang ominously in the air for your consideration, I thank you once again for your kind attention and convey you into the custody of my distinguished colleague, your illustrious co-host, the one and only, your friend and mine, Mr. Caucasian Sasquatch.